Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, July 24th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. New U.S. tariffs aimed at over 80 countries go into effect. The administration launched new duties tied to countries' imports of goods made with forced labor, replacing a 10% tariff immediately after it expired. By Anna Swanson. The Trump administration imposed tariffs of around 10% on goods from more than 80 countries on Friday, its latest effort to put in place an expansive protectionist policy that has been repeatedly challenged in court. The tariffs range from 10% to 12.5% and took effect at 12:01 a.m., replacing a global 10% duty that lapsed at the same time. Mr. Trump issued that earlier tariff in February after the Supreme Court struck down duties he imposed last year. The move provides fresh evidence of Mr. Trump's intention to transform global trade, despite numerous court challenges and the protests of U.S. consumers and businesses that have been stuck with higher tax bills. Over the past 17 months, the Trump administration has cycled through trade law after trade law as it tries to build a system to shield the U.S. economy from foreign competition. The duties were issued under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allows the president to impose tariffs on foreign countries that engage in unreasonable or discriminatory trade practices. The administration has cited the failure of foreign countries to pass or enforce laws banning the importation of goods made by forced labor into their own countries, saying that disadvantages U.S. businesses that do follow such laws. Canada, which is subject to a 10% tariff under the arrangement, already prohibits importing forced labor goods. The European Union, also at 10%, has a ban that is scheduled to take effect in December 2027. But Trump officials say that the governments have not effectively enforced those laws. The United States has arguably the strongest restrictions on forced labor imports of any country. It has prohibited the importation of goods made with slave labor for nearly a century, although it still allows prison labor under conditions that labor organizations consider coercive. In 2021, the United States passed a law banning imports from a region of China where it had found forced labor to be rampant. The Trump administration also pushed Canada and Mexico to adopt a prohibition on imports made by forced labor as part of prior trade negotiations, and 10 other countries have committed to bans as part of trade deals negotiated over the past year, a senior administration official said. But critics say the United States, too, has shortfalls on its labor protections, and some say that the administration has seized on forced labor as merely the most convenient way to reimpose tariffs struck down by the Supreme Court. Peter Harrell, a visiting scholar at Georgetown Law School and a former Biden administration official, said that the small differential in tariffs between Canada and the European Union on one hand and China on the other just brings home that USTR is using this forced labor investigation as a pretext to impose tariffs that Trump wants to impose for his own economic theories and preferences. It's not really about forced labor, he added. While Jamieson Greer, the U.S. trade representative, and other U.S. officials have publicly said they cannot prejudice the outcome of the trade investigations, administration officials have privately reassured multiple foreign governments that their tariff rates will end up being the same as in deals negotiated last year, people familiar with the discussion said. Trump's next trade scheme is ordering USTR to reconstruct his illegal global tariffs under the guise of addressing forced labor, Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat of Oregon, said in a congressional hearing Wednesday. If the administration wants to get serious about forced labor, the first step is to look at its own enforcement record. The new tariffs exempted oil and gas and certain national resources, as well as goods already covered under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or national security-related tariffs that Mr. Trump has imposed on cars, steel, and other goods. More duties are likely to be on the way in the coming weeks. The administration has proposed another batch of tariffs, also using Section 301, on 15 countries and the European Union to offset what the White House calls unfair practices in their manufacturing sectors. An administration official said Thursday that an investigation was continuing. Mr. Trump has long maintained that U.S. tariffs on imports were unfairly low, and he came into office wanting to transform that system. But his efforts have been met with plenty of stops, starts, and setbacks, reflecting the fact that a president's legal authority over tariff policy is in some ways limited. The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate trade, but legislators have written numerous laws that allow the president to issue tariffs in certain circumstances. But typically, those laws are designed to help the president address unfair trade practices in certain countries or industries, not to replace the U.S. tariff system wholesale. Mr. Harrell said that Mr. Trump's use of Section 301 was much broader than the statute intended, and that it was likely to be challenged in court. While Section 301 was supposed to be used to create leverage to push a country to address an unfair trade practice, he said, Trump is reinterpreting the statute to try to impose perpetual tariffs on all imports. They are showing that on tariffs, they can kind of run faster than the courts will, and they're going to force the courts to keep playing catch-up, he added. The Supreme Court invalidated Mr. Trump's preferred legal tool in February, when it said his use of an international emergency law to impose tariffs was unlawful and ordered roughly $160 billion in tariff revenue to be refunded. Mr. Trump has used the emergency law to announce his Liberation Day tariffs on foreign countries last year and to penalize Canada, Mexico, and China for their real or alleged role in channeling fentanyl to the United States. After the Supreme Court decision, Mr. Trump turned to Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 as a stopgap, a law that had never been used to impose tariffs before. Section 122 allows a president to impose a tariff to address balance of payment issues, but it has a 150-day limit that is set to expire early Friday. Mr. Trump's use of Section 122 has also faced legal challenges. A group of small businesses and a coalition of states each sued the administration, claiming that the government did not satisfy the law's strict criteria. In May, a majority of judges on a federal trade court agreed, handing down the second major tariff defeat against Mr. Trump. The administration appealed the decision, and the courts have allowed the government to continue collecting the 10% tax on imports as the appeal progresses. The provision that the administration is turning to next, Section 301, is more battle-tested. Mr. Trump used it to impose tariffs on China in his first term, and his use of it has survived multiple challenges in court. But it has never before been used in such a sweeping way to issue tariffs on dozens of countries simultaneously. The administration also turned to another obscure trade law earlier this week when Mr. Trump signed orders to impose a 50% tariff on billions of dollars of Canadian exports. The law, the Tariff Act of 1930, also known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, was written by Congress to shield American businesses during the onset of the Great Depression, though many historians believe it actually deepened the crisis. The Section 338 provision of the Act that the administration used had never been used to impose tariffs. Testifying in Congress on Wednesday, Mr. Greer said that the administration remained intent on imposing tariffs regardless of the legal approach. The specific authorities this administration is using have changed, but the trade strategy has not, Mr. Greer said. We are committed to continuing to use tariffs and to negotiate deals to support the reindustrialization of our economy, protect American workers, and increase their wages and shrink our trade deficit. Strikes against Saudi tankers in the Red Sea send oil past $100 a barrel. President Trump threatened attacks on Houthi militants after the Iranian ally said it had hit 2 Saudi Arabian-flagged vessels. By Max Birak, Leo Sands, and Thomas Fuller. The price of oil hit $100 a barrel on Thursday for the first time since May, after militants allied with Iran said they had hit 2 Saudi tankers in the Red Sea, stoking fears that another crucial shipping route may be choked off with a cascade of consequences for the global economy. President Trump said he would hold Iran responsible for any further attacks by the Houthi militants, who control much of Yemen. He also threatened to expand the war to include the group itself. The warning came after the United States and Iran traded strikes across the Middle East for the 12th consecutive night. The maritime strikes claimed by the Houthis were the first since the group announced a blockade on Saudi vessels earlier this week. If the Houthis hit any more ships, Mr. Trump wrote in his post, major military punishment will be inflicted upon Iran, and of course the Houthis themselves, who I am very disappointed with in that they have until now acted very professionally and smart. With the ceasefire between Iran and the United States in tatters, Democrats and a handful of Republicans in the House of Representatives on Thursday voted for a second time to demand that Mr. Trump seek congressional authorization to keep U.S. troops engaged in the war. The president effectively ignored a similar rebuke last month. The Senate voted 49 to 47 against taking up its own war powers resolution. When the United States and Iran reached a deal in June to cease hostilities and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices plummeted to pre-war levels. Countries that rely on Middle Eastern supplies relished a reprieve from a crisis that forced the cancellation of thousands of flights and ate into the budgets of hundreds of millions of people. Farmers who use diesel fuel for irrigation and machinery as well as petrochemical products like fertilizer were especially hurt. Ships of the world, start your engines. Let the oil flow, Mr. Trump declared when the deal was announced. The collapse of the ceasefire earlier this month and the resumption of daily airstrikes had already put oil-importing countries back into crisis mode. Now, the entry of Houthi militants into the war and their attacks on ships using another critical waterway has deepened the oil shock by cutting off another shipping route to Asia. The war in Ukraine has also contributed to the oil market turmoil, disrupting shipments in the Black Sea as well as fuel production at Russian refineries. U.S. stock markets opened sharply lower on Thursday, and the yield on the 10-year Treasury bond, a key indicator that influences mortgage and student loan rates, jumped past 4.7%, its highest level in many months. The European Central Bank, which last month became the first major central bank to raise interest rates in response to the war with Iran, held them steady at a meeting on Thursday. But the head of the bank, Christine Lagarde, told reporters that uncertainty remains high. The Houthi attacks raise the prospect of wider economic turmoil, especially in the shipping business. Some ships bound for Asia this week have been forced to embark on lengthy detours through the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean Sea, and around the southern tip of Africa. The delays and added costs blunt the effectiveness of a pipeline that crosses the Arabian Peninsula, which Saudi Arabia has relied on heavily during the war as an alternate pathway for oil exports. With the Persian Gulf largely closed off, oil prices are now 40% higher than they were before the United States and Israel launched the war against Iran in February. The average price of gasoline in the United States was $4.09 on Thursday, according to AAA, a 15-cent jump from a week earlier. The Saudi authorities on Thursday confirmed a strike on one of its ships, the Encilia, without specifying the origin of the attack. It said that the crew was safe. The Saudis have not commented on the Houthi claim regarding a second ship. Neither the United States nor Iran has signaled much appetite for a return to negotiations. In recent days, Iranian and American officials have instead vowed to respond to each other's attacks with fresh ones of their own. U.S. Central Command, which coordinates military operations in the Middle East, said it had launched a wave of strikes overnight to denigrate Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping, targeting drone and missile storage sites and air defenses. That language, which the U.S. military has employed on a daily basis, does not explicitly acknowledge U.S. strikes on infrastructure that can be used for civilian purposes, like roads and ports. Such attacks could be considered war crimes under international law. Mr. Trump has threatened to attack a bridge or power plant anytime the Islamic Republic of Iran shoots at a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said overnight that it had launched attacks on U.S. military targets in Jordan and Kuwait, including a communications tower, accusing the U.S. forces of attacking equivalent infrastructure in Iran. Videos circulating on social media and verified by the New York Times showed two of Iraq's border crossings attacked on Thursday, with people carrying suitcases fleeing the explosions. The first attack occurred in the early hours of Thursday near the Iranian side of Shalom Sheikh border crossing in Khuzestan province. Iranian and Iraqi media outlets reported that a rest station for police officers at the crossing had been hit by U.S. airstrikes. U.S. Central Command did not immediately respond to questions about the attack. Additional footage showed a damaged telecommunications tower inside a small compound within the border crossing facility. In what appeared to be a retaliatory strike, the Abdali border crossing between Kuwait and Iraq was also hit on Thursday afternoon. General Saud Abdulaziz al-Otabi, a spokesman for Kuwait's defense ministry, said in a statement that the crossing had come under attack by hostile drones, without specifying their origin, and that there had been no casualties. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. U.S. withdraws subpoenas issued to New York Times journalists. A federal judge raised questions about the government's handling of the subpoenas, which the Times called an attempt to intimidate the free press. By Michael M. Grinbaum and Jonah E. Bromwich. The Justice Department on Thursday withdrew the subpoenas that sought phone records and grand jury testimony from New York Times journalists who had reported on the security capabilities of President Trump's new Qatari-donated Air Force One jet. The government acted after a federal judge grilled Justice Department lawyers for nearly an hour over their handling of the subpoenas, which the Times had sought to quash. The news outlet called the subpoenas an effort to intimidate its reporters. Judge Aaron Subramanian, at a hearing in U.S. District Court in Manhattan, said the government was not prevented from subpoenaing the Times reporters again if it followed appropriate procedures. The case was a high-profile instance of the Trump administration's efforts to escalate pressure on independent news organizations. The government issued the subpoenas, some of which were delivered by federal agents at reporters' homes, after Mr. Trump was angered by the Times disclosures about his new jet, which he had flown to Turkey this month and eagerly showed off. Shortly after the Times published its reporting, the White House instructed Kash Patel, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to pursue a leak investigation to unmask confidential sources who had provided information to the newspaper about a national security matter. On Thursday, Judge Subramanian zeroed in on whether the government had heeded the law and its own regulations on investigations involving the news media. He said subpoenas to reporters are not the first thing you do. They are the last thing you do. It's a matter of basic compliance with the law, he added. After Thursday's hearing, the Justice Department criticized Judge Subramanian, saying in a statement that his conduct overrides clear, long-standing principles and common sense. Make no mistake, this investigation remains ongoing, the Justice Department said, and we will pursue justice against those threatening national security by leaking classified information, a serious federal crime. The White House did not respond to a request for comment. After the Times moved to block the subpoenas, the government asked the judge to delay their effect for 2 weeks so it could investigate further. But at Thursday's hearing on the 23rd floor of the federal courthouse in Manhattan, it was quickly apparent that Judge Subramanian was skeptical of the government's initial approach and request for delay. Within 10 minutes, he had laid out a stark choice to the Justice Department. Either we can quash the subpoenas or you could withdraw the subpoenas, the judge told Sean Buckley, a top official in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan who was speaking on behalf of the government. Judge Subramanian then grilled the prosecutors for the vast majority of the hour-long hearing. He asked few questions of the Times lawyers, At one point, he even apologized to one of them and promised time to respond to some of the government's statements. Under the judge's questioning, the government acknowledged factual errors in its filings. It conceded that it had omitted significant information, including that the case pertained to journalists' records, when it asked a different federal judge to prevent a phone company from disclosing a record request. The inadvertent errors and the "in hindsight we should have done things differently," these things are piling up, the judge said. Mr. Buckley argued that the nature of the Times reporting on sensitive national security matters had allowed for an exception to standard procedures, but he struggled to identify the precise legal rationale for that exception when the judge pressed him. Judge Subramanian appeared especially troubled by the government's omission of relevant details from its request for the non-disclosure order from the other federal judge. Neither the Times nor Judge Subramanian would have been aware of that request had the government not volunteered it days later. The prosecutor who handled that application, Kevin Sullivan, was seated in the gallery, but Judge Subramanian asked that he walk to the front of the courtroom to explain the irregularities. "Are you going to do this again?" the judge asked Mr. Sullivan at the end of questioning. "No, Your Honor, absolutely not," the prosecutor replied. After the hearing, Judge Subramanian asked the government to provide him with its private communications regarding the application for the non-disclosure order, a sign that the judge may not be finished with the matter. Mr. Buckley also acknowledged that the phone record subpoenas had inadvertently encompassed relatives of the Times reporters, including the mother of one and the spouses of two others, calling it an error and a consequence of trying to move quickly. After an hour of questioning on Thursday, prosecutors abruptly asked for a break so they could confer with the Times lawyers. 10 minutes later, Mr. Buckley, who had left the courtroom while the other lawyers huddled, returned and announced that the government would withdraw its subpoenas. The Times praised the outcome of the hearing. "Today's proceeding was an important affirmation of our country's commitment to a free press," David McCraw, the paper's top newsroom lawyer, said in a statement. "We are pleased that the government finally conceded that the subpoenas violated the law, but they should never have been issued in the first place." As the hearing wound down, Judge Subramanian asked a lawyer for the Times, David A. O'Neill, if he had anything to add. Mr. O'Neill said the government's conduct had been replete with bad faith and lamented a chilling effect that he said had affected the journalist's ability to report. "We dispute any allegation of bad faith," Mr. Buckley said, "and I'll just leave it at that." Number of U.S. troop deaths suddenly appears lower on Pentagon website. 3 military officials and a Pentagon spokesman gave conflicting explanations for why the number of Americans killed in the Iran war had changed. By Helena Cooper, Lara Jakes, and John Ismay. On Wednesday, the Pentagon reported on its casualties website that a total of 18 American service members had been killed during the war in Iran. By Thursday, the Defense Department had lowered that number, reporting that 14 American troops had been killed in the war. 3 military officials said that one reason behind the change was that the Trump administration decided to remove 4 service members killed this past weekend from the list, 3 in Jordan and 1 in northern Iraq, because their deaths occurred after President Trump declared a ceasefire in the war in April. The officials described sensitive internal discussions on the condition of anonymity. The acting press secretary for the Pentagon, Joel Valdez, attributed the change instead to temporary data disruptions on the website that he suggested would be quickly fixed. Since the ceasefire collapsed, the Pentagon has provided little information about the American military strategy and has been slow to release information about troops' injuries. The last major Pentagon briefing on the war was in early May. The Defense Department has said that disclosing Iranian strikes on bases where U.S. troops are housed would compromise operational security. The Pentagon withheld information about 3 Iranian strikes last week in Jordan that injured dozens of U.S. service members and damaged several helicopters, according to several U.S. officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss operational matters. After an Iranian strike in Jordan on Friday killed 3 soldiers, the Pentagon's chief spokesman, Sean Parnell, acknowledged that the number of U.S. military casualties since July 7th had risen to nearly 100. Defense Department officials say they are bound by law to report troop deaths, but not injuries. Critics, including Democratic senators, say the Trump administration is obliged to inform the public about the conduct of the war. The administration seems to have a real hard time being honest about what is going on, not just about casualties, but about the whole war in general, said retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, a veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, who commanded U.S. forces in Europe at the start of Mr. Trump's first term. General Hodges said that downplaying deaths during war indicated an unwillingness or inability to aggressively learn from mistakes. The issue of troop deaths is significant because both President Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth have essentially made it so. Both men have repeatedly said that their predecessors, President Joseph R. Biden Jr. and Defense Secretary Lloyd J. Austin III, as well as Vice President Kamala Harris, were personally responsible for the deaths of 13 American service members in a suicide attack in Kabul in 2021. These people shouldn't have died, Mr. Trump told podcaster Lex Fridman in 2024. They died because of Biden and because of Kamala. They died just like if they pulled the trigger. Dozens of Afghans were also killed in the attack at Abbey Gate, a main entryway at Hamid Karzai International Airport during the chaotic U.S. evacuation from the country. The Pentagon has indicated that it is preparing to release a review of the Afghanistan withdrawal that Mr. Hegseth ordered. That review, led by Mr. Parnell, will ensure accountability to the American people and the war fighters of our great nation, Mr. Hegseth wrote last year in announcing the effort. In its casualty toll for the Iran war, the Pentagon has separated the number of troops killed under fire from those killed in accidents. As of Wednesday, its data showed that 11 service members were killed in hostilities and 7 in accidents related to the war. The 7 killed in accidents include the crew of a U.S. military KC-135 refueling aircraft that crashed in Iraq in March as part of the war campaign in neighboring Iran. By Thursday morning, the number of deaths on the site had been changed to 14, with 7 classified as hostile. Mr. Valdez referred to the changes as site anomalies and said they were being resolved. The department attempted to explain the anomalies to the New York Times ahead of publication, but given their lack of knowledge in this area, they proceeded to write a non-story, he said in an email, adding, "We remain committed to ensuring the utmost accuracy of all casualty reporting." Mr. Trump has continued to refer to the high number of U.S. troop deaths. In comments on Thursday, he compared the toll from other American wars to the war against Iran, saying that even one death is too many, but it's 18. On Wednesday, Mr. Trump witnessed the return of the bodies of the 4 service members at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, calling them great heroes. Later, Mr. Trump took one soldier's grieving family to his political rally in Georgia. Peter Feaver, a political scientist professor at Duke University who studies the military, said the loss of any service member was a tragedy. It's important to remember that every one of those numbers is a personal story, he added. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. New York faces $500 billion in storm prevention costs, report finds. A study from a group called Rebuild by Design estimates that the money will be needed to repair the effects of climate change in the next 24 years. By Hillary Howard. 3 years ago, a deluge overwhelmed Highland Falls, New York. A murky river rushed through Main Street, and one woman was swept away with the currents after leaving her home. Now, the Hudson Valley Village has to spend $500,000 a year just to pay the interest on the money it borrowed for crucial repairs. Damaging storms are nothing new to the New York City metropolitan area. This summer alone, heavy rains and winds have downed power lines in Connecticut, submerged cars in New Jersey and the Bronx, and turned parts of New York City's fashionable Soho neighborhood into a wading pool. With climate change, these storms will become stronger and more frequent. They will also become more expensive. New York State is projected to surpass $500 billion on infrastructure spending related to climate change by 2050, according to a new report. Rebuild by Design, the nonprofit behind the analysis, was created after Hurricane Sandy to work with New York City agencies on flood-related protection initiatives. The group scoured public records across the state for plans to prepare for the impact of global warming, including government proposals awaiting funding, projects underway, and those completed after Hurricane Sandy. It then compiled the costs of that work to arrive at the $519 billion tally. And that doesn't even include the cost of future disasters, a cost that can easily reach into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Amy Chester, the director of Rebuild by Design, said paying for the work will fall on local and state governments, which could also mean higher taxes for residents. The needs in this analysis far exceed the resources available, she said. James DeSalvo, the mayor of Highland Falls, which is part of the town of Highlands and is about 55 miles north of New York City, knows this truth all too well. I borrowed $6 million and played what I like to call Iron Man football, he said. I would do some work, get paid back, do some more work, get paid back. And still, the village needed more money. In 2024, its budget increased by more than 7% and its taxes by more than 5%, according to Mr. DeSalvo. The report found more than 700 federal, state, and local initiatives that governments had committed to paying for or were being planned. These projects addressed sea level rise, erosion, grid vulnerabilities, stormwater management, wind and storm damage, and sewer upgrades. In New York City, which faces significant infrastructure, flooding, and extreme heat problems, and also has several plans in place to address these issues, the cost of climate change preparations breaks down to about $50,000 per resident. Smaller towns may not have plans on the books to protect their communities, so their projected costs are much smaller. In Highland Falls, the work and the expenses are ongoing. The village's water tanks were damaged and are still being repaired. It takes forever, Mr. DeSalvo said. Again, if I had an unlimited supply of money, it'd be a different story. The village, which is built into the side of a large hill, has a brook that runs through it. The flooding was caused by the 9 inches of rain that fell within hours and the downhill runoff it produced, not by the waterway overflowing. Roads and bridges were washed out. In front of Mr. DeSalvo's childhood home, fish were swimming on the street, he said. Notably, many of the village's 100-year-old retaining walls crumbled, which proved to be the most expensive item to repair, the mayor said. Some of those walls are on private property, but homeowners are experiencing difficulty being reimbursed by the Federal Emergency Management Agency or qualifying for flood insurance because the village does not sit in a floodplain. That scenario is becoming more common across the country. FEMA also requires counties to accrue a certain amount of financial damage before the president can declare a disaster, which then qualifies them for federal aid. The storms earlier this summer did not even come close, which means residents and local governments will pay for any repairs. These costs get passed on to families in the form of tax increases, insurance hikes, damages, home repairs, and business losses, Ms. Chester of Rebuild said. In some cases, a state might surpass the FEMA threshold to receive aid, but the president still has the authority to deny help. In February, when a blizzard shut down most of New York, Governor Kathy Hochul requested a major disaster declaration from President Trump. This month, he denied the governor's request. New York's Homeland Security and Emergency Services Agency said that New York State remains committed to helping residents after disasters. But the money has to come from somewhere. The Rebuild by Design report calls for a comprehensive statewide plan for increasingly extreme weather and sea level rise. Without one, communities are left to develop incomplete, uncoordinated, and often under-resourced strategies for climate adaptation, which results in uneven levels of protection, said Robert E. Breen, an environmental expert at the University of Albany. Such a plan is especially important, the report says, given federal opposition to other sources of disaster funding. In late 2024, Ms. Hochul signed a law requiring major fossil fuel companies to help pay to repair damage caused by extreme weather. Burning oil and gas warms the planet, which can supercharge storms and droughts. Called the Climate Change Superfund Act, it requires those companies to pay $75 billion over 25 years into an account for infrastructure repairs and upgrades, as well as recovery efforts after disasters. But in early 2025, the law was challenged in court, with 22 states, led by West Virginia, arguing that individual states should not dictate federal energy policy. This summer, New Yorkers could learn the fate of those billions, with a judge in Syracuse expected to rule on the case. Trump demands Saudi Arabia normalize relations with Israel as part of nuclear deal. The president's new condition could create a roadblock to the agreement his administration announced this week. By David E. Sanger and Karun Demirjian. A day after the United States signed a landmark nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia, President Trump added a new condition to the sale of nuclear reactors to the kingdom, declaring that the entire arrangement now depends on the Saudi willingness to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. The deal is totally subject to Saudi Arabia joining the very respected and successful Abraham Accords, Mr. Trump said in a post on his social media site, referring to a series of agreements that normalized relations between Israel and other states, including Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. There was no mention of any such condition in the administration's announcement that the deal had been signed on Wednesday, and the text of the deal has not been released. But Mr. Trump's social media post put the agreement's immediate future in doubt. The Saudi government has made clear it has no intention of recognizing Israel without creating a pathway toward the creation of a Palestinian state. Mr. Trump's post did not address the Saudi government's conditions for establishing diplomatic ties with Israel. Saudi officials have not responded to repeated requests for comment. When a reporter pressed Caroline Leavitt, the White House spokeswoman, on why the condition was not mentioned in the announcement of the deal on Wednesday, she said the president was the final dealmaker and had mentioned the need for Saudi Arabia to join the accords on numerous occasions. She was definitive on the president's terms. They don't join the Abraham Accords, the deal is off, Ms. Leavitt said. In linking the deal to diplomatic recognition of Israel, Mr. Trump is veering back to the plan that President Joseph R. Biden Jr. attempted in the first years of his administration, making nuclear cooperation part of a larger diplomatic understanding that changes the dynamics of the Middle East. But the plan fell apart after the October 7, 2023 terrorist attacks on Israel by Hamas, and Mr. Trump later divorced the nuclear agreement from the diplomatic effort. He has now reversed himself, but only after his energy secretary, Chris Wright, signed the deal with Saudi Arabia's energy minister. Mr. Wright indicated that the deal would now be sent to Congress for review, but presumably Mr. Trump could hold up its transmission while he argues with the Saudis over the new condition. Not surprisingly, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel warmly greeted Mr. Trump's demand that the Saudis normalize relations with Israel. The joint American and Israeli military action against the genocidal regime in Tehran and Israel's crushing of Iran's terror axis have created the possibility to expand the circle of peace, he said in a statement. Saudi Arabia's Center for International Communication did not immediately respond to requests for comment on Mr. Trump's demand. Mr. Trump also asserted that the terms of the deal would not allow Saudi Arabia to enrich its own nuclear material, offering no further explanation. While the agreement has not been made public, officials have described it very differently, saying that it allows for a 2-year study period, during which Saudi and American officials will determine if there is a viable economic path for the kingdom to enrich nuclear fuel. The United States could block that move for a number of years, according to officials familiar with the arrangement, but not permanently. Mr. Trump argued otherwise. There will be no enrichment of material, he stated, adding that the United States is not opposed to civil, non-enriched nuclear facilities. The potential that Saudi Arabia could make its own fuel and the risk that some of it could be diverted to a nuclear weapons project in the future lies at the core of criticism of the deal. But the country's de facto leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is unlikely to give up the right to enrich or agree to the most intrusive international inspections that more than 140 other nations have already signed. Mr. Trump's statement comes after Israeli leaders voiced concerns over the emerging deal, worrying that it could fuel a regional arms race and the implication of Israel being sidestepped in the process. But Mr. Trump's newly stated condition could create a roadblock to the deal itself, as Saudi officials have repeatedly stated that they will not recognize Israel without a pathway toward a Palestinian state. Mr. Trump has previously pushed to expand the Abraham Accords, agreements he began brokering during his first term. The first, between Israel and Bahrain and the Emirates, were announced in 2020. Since then, Morocco and Sudan have joined the pact. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. A new target for Ukraine's long-range attacks, Russia's version of Amazon. Kyiv is escalating its air war by striking commercial warehouses, trying to bring the conflict closer to home for ordinary Russians. By Valerie Hopkins and Alina Lobzina. Russian businesses have been feeling the effects of the war in Ukraine through tax increases, rising costs caused by fuel shortages, and supply chains disrupted by sanctions. Now there is another risk to contend with: Ukrainian drone strikes on their facilities. As Ukraine wages a campaign to bring the conflict home to ordinary Russians, it has opened a new front aimed at the online marketplace Wildberries, a pillar of the country's retail economy and a potent symbol of modern life in Russia. In recent days, Ukraine has hit 5 warehouses belonging to Wildberries, a Russian analog to Amazon, as well as storage sites for other large retailers. 8 people were killed in attacks on Saturday and 1 person on Wednesday, the Russian authorities said. The strikes on Saturday alone were reported to have wiped out between 6 and 9% of the total storage capacity of Wildberries. Ukraine's long-range strikes on Russian economic targets, including a months-long campaign of attacks on oil processing facilities, are intended to pressure President Vladimir V. Putin to end the war, in part by hampering his ability to finance it. The oil strikes have caused fuel shortages that have led to lines at gas stations, and they could affect the coming harvest season. Mr. Putin has signaled no intention of backing away from his objectives in the conflict, and the economy, while weakened by the war, is not on the verge of collapse. Still, analysts said that if the attacks on Russia's business infrastructure continued, the ripple effects could pose severe economic challenges on top of a range of other war-related strains, reducing tax collections and adding to inflation. Ukraine has targeted Wildberries warehouses in 5 regions across Russia, including a reported strike early Thursday in the Voronezh region, south of Moscow. A fire at a warehouse in Elektrostal, a city in the Moscow region, took 3 days to extinguish. The day after the initial strikes, Russia unleashed the largest missile attack on Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, since the war started in 2022, firing at least 35 ballistic and hypersonic cruise missiles. Ukraine has said that its strikes are in retaliation for Russian attacks on its postal delivery hubs and other civilian infrastructure, a years-long campaign by Moscow that has been far more devastating than Kyiv's strikes against Russia. A Russian attack last week on a postal terminal in the northeastern city of Kharkiv left 3 people dead and 20 injured. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has also said that Wildberries facilities are a legitimate target because the company sells goods to the Russian military. The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry S. Peskov has denied the accusation. Wildberries has a policy of not selling military-grade weapons, but it does sell goods used by soldiers, like commercial drones that can be jury-rigged with explosives, as well as fiber optic cables, tactical clothing, and other so-called dual-use items. The Wildberries attacks have been calamitous for small Russian entrepreneurs who sell goods through the site, the country's largest online marketplace. One of them, Timur, woke up on Saturday morning to the news that he had lost clothing and shoes worth about $25,000 as a result of the attacks on the Wild Berries warehouses in Elektrostal and Kotovsk in the Tambov region, southeast of Moscow. Timur, who was nervous about speaking with foreign journalists when reached by telephone and asked that his last name be withheld to avoid reprisals, said that his main concern was the uncertainty that he and other Russian entrepreneurs now faced. He said on Tuesday that it was unclear what would happen next because most likely they are not the only warehouses that will be attacked. Hours later, 2 more Wild Berries warehouses that contained his apparel in the southern Stavropol and Krasnodar regions were hit by drones. His losses doubled. Timur warned of the effects on the Russian economy, saying that continued strikes would cause the Wild Berries business model to collapse, raising prices and bringing about shortages. Alexander Kolyandir, director for Europe at the Eurasia Group, a consulting firm, echoed that view. The company itself and all the sellers will likely pay less in taxes than last year, and given the size, it might be pretty substantial, especially at a time when the Russian budget is experiencing a widening deficit, Mr. Kolyandir said. Additionally, the cost of protecting and rebuilding and insuring the warehouses will be passed on to consumers, he said, contributing to already high levels of inflation. The attacks on Saturday in the Moscow and Tambov regions destroyed goods worth almost as much as Wild Berries' entire profit last year, according to expert estimates reported by Kommersant, a Russian newspaper, and by Forbes Russia. The company's chief executive, Tatiana Kim, promised financial compensation of about $25,000 to families of the workers who were killed, and half of that amount to the injured. Many sellers on Wild Berries financed their products with loans, including Timur, who told of interest rates as high as 35%. Some vendors risk having their bank accounts frozen as soon as next week if they are unable to make tax payments due in the coming days, according to the new business paper Vendomosti. A civilian facility like a warehouse can become a lawful military target if it is being used or is being prepared to be used for military purposes, said Michael Schmidt, who teaches international law at the University of Reading in England and is a former legal advisor to the U.S. military. Combatants, he said, must take into account exactly what kind of materials are inside, have a high degree of certainty about the site's future military use, and make efforts to mitigate harm to civilians. Maria Znegovia, a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, said that Russia's economic slowdown, related in part to Ukraine's long-range strikes, had coincided with declining levels of support for the war. But some in Russia said that the increased drumbeat of attacks could rally Russians around their leader. The adversaries started doing the job of our propaganda, which is to explain to the nation that a real war is underway, and no one can just lie low, a Russian military blogger, Roman Sapankov, wrote on Telegram. At first, they switched off fuel at the petrol station. Now they took on Wild Berries warehouses. Next, it will be beer factories and nail salons. Salty, buttery, astonishingly lucrative. The $100 million market of popcorn buckets. Once, a tub of popcorn was just a tub of popcorn. Now, collectible concession vessels could make one chain more than $100 million. By Nicole Sperling. First, Bill Howard surrendered his cell phone. Then he signed the non-disclosure agreement. He sat for an hour and a half that day on the Universal Pictures studio lot with a single paper copy of a script for an upcoming movie. He pored over it alone, scribbling in the one notepad he was permitted, thinking about his craft. How would he bring his unique set of skills to bear on this particular project and help make it a blockbuster? Many a Hollywood elite has entered a sealed room to read a top-secret script, but Mr. Howard is not an A-list actor. He's not a cinematographer or a CGI artist. What Mr. Howard makes is buckets. Popcorn buckets, or as they are more formally known, collectible concession vessels. These special edition snack receptacles are designed for major movies and can sell for as much as $70. All the studios and theater chains want in on them. because for some inexplicable reasons, they have become astonishingly lucrative. AMC Theaters estimate that this year, buckets will generate $100 million in revenue, nearly double the level of 2023. Cinemark Theaters, the country's third-largest chain, says bucket sales helped its merchandise revenue increase 40% from 2024 to 2025. 7 years ago, this business effectively didn't exist for AMC, said Nels Storm, the company's vice president of food and beverage product strategy. I would never suggest that popcorn buckets are the reason people go to the movies, or that movie-themed merch is saving the industry, but over the last few years, they've become a big part of the conversation around major releases. Mr. Howard, 71, is the chief executive at Snap Creative, which is based in Camarillo, California, and employs 55 people. Snap is behind two of this summer's hottest buckets. Both are tied to the release of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. One is a replica of the director's IMAX camera, priced at $50, and the other is a 22-inch rendering of the Trojan horse, which sells for $70. To make them, Mr. Howard and his team met early on with one of the film's producers, Emma Thomas, to get a walkthrough of the story beats. Then, they approached IMAX with their ideas. Rich Gelfond, the theater chain's chief executive, was skeptical about the camera concept bucket. I know a lot about the movie business, and I didn't really know much about the bucket business, he said. It was beyond me to really envision that there'd be a strong demand for $50 popcorn buckets. He approved a first run of 2,500 units. They sold out almost immediately. Movie fans don't buy buckets just in theaters. Often they order them in advance and receive them in the mail without any popcorn inside. To get more buckets, Mr. Gelfond called up the chief executive of IMAX China and begged him to ship over all his buckets, since the film wouldn't open there until August. His counterpart agreed, and when IMAX made the second run of 2,500 buckets available, they sold out in 7 minutes. Between its website and purchases at theaters, IMAX thinks it sold some 30,000 buckets. Nearly all of Hollywood's buckets are made by 3 companies. In addition to Snap, there are Golden Link, which is based in New York and is the bucket partner of Disney Studios, and Zinc, an Australian firm that has bucketed the Dune and Mission Impossible franchises. Snap, Golden Link, and Zinc license the intellectual property of the films from the studios and collaborate with them on the designs. Snap's creative director was recently in Atlanta on the set of the next Superman installment and spoke directly to the director, James Gunn, about bucket concepts. When you get it right with the filmmaker, you know you're on your way, Mr. Howard said. Movie theaters have long sold special popcorn containers, but the industry consensus is that the current craze has 2 specific inflection points. One came in 2019 when a bucket commissioned for Disney's The Rise of Skywalker, a 17-inch replica of R2-D2, sold surprisingly well. The second accelerant involved, and there's really no other way to put this, the distressingly sexual features of a bucket for Dune Part 2 in 2024. Modeled on the gaping maw of an alien sandworm, the design inspired a sketch on Saturday Night Live about amorous teenagers and took the bucket market to previously unimaginable heights. There is evidence that bucket fever transcends youth. In May, a red handbag-shaped bucket for The Devil Wears Prada 2 sold out over the film's opening weekend, with many going to older women who were fans of the 20-year-old original movie. The interest left exhibitors lamenting that they hadn't ordered more. Ordering too few buckets creates a powerful sense of scarcity, but sometimes buckets don't sell. The recent Supergirl was a dud, and so was its bucket, which featured the heroine's reluctant sidekick Lobo riding a space hog motorcycle. Perhaps they should have made a bucket that featured the film's main character. Outcomes in the bucket realm can be inscrutable. Masters of the Universe was a box office disappointment last month, as was one of its buckets, a light-up throne belonging to the supervillain Skeletor. Yet a second bucket, featuring Castle Grayskull, was a hit. It featured both a detachable drink tumbler and a candy compartment. And popular films can have buckets that bomb, as in the case of Hoppers from Disney's Pixar, and a vessel shaped like a beaver dam. Bad buckets create headaches for exhibitors. Then we have an inventory issue for local theaters, said Vicki Neal, the head of marketing for Regal Global Entertainment, the second largest theater chain. What do we do with that merchandise? Do we ship it back? Do we sell it at a discount? It starts to get complicated. But mostly the buckets overfloweth. Regal said its merchandise sales would surpass $40 million this year, and buckets themselves are only getting bigger. At the end of August, for the re-release of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Mr. Howard's company will unveil its largest bucket ever, a 4-foot replica of Harry's Nimbus 2000 broom. It will sell for $50 and somehow store 135 ounces of popcorn. That is 270% the capacity of the Odyssey horse, which holds 50 ounces in its belly. Pretty average for a bucket, Mr. Howard said. It should be noted that conventional paper bucket, large size, contains 170 ounces of popcorn by volume, or a little more than 21 cups. That is often immaterial to bucket enthusiasts who sometimes have no interest in popcorn. Recently on eBay, a batch of 20 buckets celebrating The Accountant 2, about a skilled assassin who is also an autism spectrum CPA, sold for $550. Bucket makers are still obligated to ensure that their collectible concession vessels work. It's important that these function as buckets, Mr. Howard said. We don't want butter leaking out of them, and we want people to be able to clean out the kernels. Your hand has to be able to go in and get the popcorn. Okay, you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, July 24th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening.